In the shadow of North Korea's towering statues and perfectly choreographed parades lies a very different truth, one that is hidden behind polished facades and silenced through fear. To the outside world, the Hermit Kingdom presents an image of absolute strength, a nation unified under the iron will of its leaders, unwavering in its ideology, and defiant in the face of international pressure. But beyond the rigid formations of soldiers marching in unison, beyond the choreographed smiles of children performing patriotic dances, a quiet reality unfolds, a story of hunger, hardship, and survival. The grandeur of Pyongyang's skyline, with its monolithic structures and state-funded projects, serves not just as architecture but as propaganda. It is meant to inspire awe and reverence, to convey the illusion of a thriving socialist utopia. But venture beyond the capital and the shine begins to fade. In rural provinces, electricity is a luxury, food is rationed if available at all, and access to basic healthcare or education is inconsistent at best. The further one moves from the city center, the more the cracks begin to show. And those cracks tell a story of a people who have long suffered in silence. For decades, the regime has relied on absolute control of not just governance, but of truth itself. Information is filtered, foreign media is banned, and dissent is crushed before it can ever find its voice. The official narrative tells of prosperity, of scientific achievement, and of the benevolent leadership of the Kim dynasty. But the people living under that rule know better. They know the sting of an empty stomach. They know the fear of being watched. They know that to speak out is to disappear. Yet, despite all this, the people endure. They find ways to survive outside the bounds of state control. Markets once considered subversive have emerged as lifelines. Communities have created underground networks for medicine, information, and faith. Even in the darkest winters, mothers find a way to feed their children, doctors perform surgeries by candlelight, and whispered prayers rise from hidden corners. It is in these quiet acts of resistance that the true strength of North Korea can be found not in missiles or military displays, but in the resilience of ordinary people. This story is not just about a nation, but about the individuals within it, each one navigating an unforgiving landscape shaped by oppression. It is a story of stolen dreams, of silent rebellion, and of the human spirit's refusal to be broken. To understand North Korea, one must look past the grandeur, past the propaganda, and listen instead to the stories whispered in the dark. Because behind every monument is a mother, a father, a child, fighting not for ideology, but for survival. It was in the depths of the 1990s, amid crumbling promises and the silent decay of a once tightly controlled system, that North Korea's people were left to face a brutal reality. The famine that swept the country during this period, known as the Arduous March, was more than a humanitarian crisis. It was a collapse of the very foundations on which the regime claimed to stand. Crops failed, supply lines fractured, and the much-vaunted public distribution system, once the proud symbol of the state's self-reliance, fell apart entirely. What followed was not just widespread hunger, but a shattering of trust between the people and the state that had promised to protect them. Imagine waking each morning not to the sound of hope, but to the ache of an empty stomach. For millions, this was daily life. Fields lay barren, and food became an object of desperation. Children foraged for wild grasses. Families boiled tree bark to stave off starvation. People sold off their furniture, their clothing, even their roofs, just to afford a bowl of cornmeal. And yet, amidst the despair, something extraordinary happened, something the regime neither expected nor could fully control. The people began to adapt. They began to survive not because of the system, but in spite of it. From the ashes of starvation rose the Jangmadang informal black markets that sprang up in towns and villages across the nation. These were not just places of trade. They were acts of quiet rebellion. Here, outside the bounds of state planning and oversight, North Koreans bartered, bought, and sold in a new kind of economy, one built not on ideology, but on necessity. For the first time, the people were no longer passive recipients of state provisions. They were participants in their own survival. Take the story of a woman from the city of Hyasan, once a respected schoolteacher. When her monthly state salary could no longer feed her children, when the rations stopped arriving and her classroom emptied, she turned to something as simple, yet profound, as tofu. With no official permission, no license, and no protection, she began making tofu at home. Day after day, she rose before dawn, grinding soybeans, shaping her product, and carrying it to the Jangmadang. There, among rows of makeshift stalls and whispered negotiations, she sold her homemade goods. People came to know her not as a teacher, but as the tofu queen. Her enterprise was modest, but it meant survival not just for her, but for her entire family. And she was not alone. All across the country, former engineers became bicycle mechanics. Housewives turned into street vendors. Teenagers smuggled goods from China across frozen rivers. The regime, which once outlawed such activity as capitalist corruption, found itself unable to fully suppress it. After all, it was this gray economy that now kept the country afloat. Slowly, grudgingly, the state turned a blind eye, even as it continued to trumpet the myth of Juche, its philosophy of self-reliance and state-centered prosperity. But ask anyone who lived through it, and they will tell you, the real resilience came not from policy, but from the people. From mothers like the tofu seller, who refused to let her children starve. From elderly men who retrained their hands to build carts or mend shoes. From girls who risked their lives slipping across borders at night, just to bring back food or medicine. These were the quiet revolutionaries, unarmed, unnoticed, but unyielding. The Jangmadang was not just a market, it was a lifeline, a microcosm of a new reality where skills, grit, and community mattered more than party loyalty. And it was dangerous. The police could raid a stall at any moment. Sellers could be imprisoned. Yet still, the stalls returned each day, rising like weeds through the cracks in the state's crumbling facade. The regime claimed the arduous march was a heroic time, a test of the people's loyalty. But those who lived it knew better. It was a time of hunger, of heartbreak, and of hard choices. And yet, it was also a time when ordinary North Koreans rediscovered their agency. Viewers often wonder, how do people in such a closed, repressive state survive? The answer lies not in the slogans or the monuments, but in the streets, the kitchens, and the marketplaces. It lies in the courage of women who carried their tofu on their backs through snowstorms. It lies in the innovation of communities who built clinics with no electricity and schools with no books. And yes, it lies in the defiance of every Jangmadang seller who dared to believe that survival was not a crime. So, as we explore the shadowy corners of North Korea's grand narrative, let us remember this. Behind every tank parade and every portrait of a supreme leader, there is a teacher boiling soybeans in a cracked pot, keeping her family alive with nothing but determination. And that, more than any missile or military doctrine, is what sustains the nation. Because in North Korea, survival itself is an act of rebellion. And in the forgotten stalls of the Jangmadang, a quiet revolution still simmers one bowl of tofu at a time. Once hailed as a triumph of socialist vision, North Korea's universal healthcare system stood as a proud symbol of the regime's commitment to its people. In propaganda posters and state-run documentaries, hospitals gleamed with advanced equipment. Doctors in crisp white coats smiled confidently, and patients recovered miraculously, all under the protective wing of the Workers' Party. It was a promise, from cradle to grave, the state would take care of its citizens. But in the shadow of that promise, a different truth began to unfold. The collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s marked a silent death knell for North Korea's economy. Foreign aid dried up, trade halted, and the country's already fragile infrastructure began to unravel. As food supplies dwindled, and the arduous march pushed families to the brink of starvation, another quieter crisis emerged, one that would test not just stomachs, but bodies and spirits. The hospitals, once the pride of Pyongyang, fell into ruin. Electricity became a luxury, and without it, the machines that sustained life turned to lifeless metal. Sterilizers sat idle. X-ray machines gathered dust. Surgeons reached for scalpels under flickering candlelight. In the city of Hamhung, a doctor recalled performing emergency surgery on a young boy with a ruptured appendix. There was no anesthesia, no functioning lights, and no oxygen supply. Just his trembling hands, a flashlight held by a nurse, and years of training driven by desperation. The boy survived, but not because of the system. He survived despite it. Across the country, medical workers fought an uphill battle. In some rural clinics, IV drips were fashioned from empty beer bottles. Bandages were boiled and reused until they disintegrated. Antibiotics, when available, were split into quarters, rationed like gold. Tuberculosis, once nearly eradicated, returned with a vengeance. Malaria spread. Cholera outbreaks became terrifyingly common. In the coastal city of Wonsan, an entire neighborhood was quarantined after a cholera outbreak swept through the community, most likely caused by contaminated water and a lack of proper sanitation. The state's silence was deafening. And yet, as always, the people refused to surrender. When hospitals could no longer provide, families turned elsewhere to the very same Jangmadang markets that had become their lifeline for food. But these were not just stalls for rice or tofu anymore. Now, hidden beneath layers of fabric or stashed inside suitcases, lay medicine smuggled from China, antibiotics, aspirin, even insulin. It was dangerous work. A single bottle of medicine, if caught in the wrong hands, could mean imprisonment. But demand grew, and with it, a new kind of healer emerged, the medicine aunties. Older women who knew what to find, who to bribe, and how to navigate the black market's shifting tides. One such woman in Sinuiju became a local legend. She had once worked as a nurse but had lost her post when the clinic she served closed during the famine. With what little she had saved, she began procuring medicine from across the border, distributing it to neighbors, friends, even strangers. Her home became a quiet pharmacy. No signs, no lights. Just whispered conversations and silent transactions. People called her the healer without a hospital. In cities like Pyeongseong and Hyesan, these informal networks filled the vacuum left by the state. Mothers lined up at dawn, clutching faded prescriptions in the hopes that the market might offer a cure. Some paid in money, others in rice, cigarettes, or favors. In the absence of trust in institutions, trust in each other took its place. Yet while the state failed to supply modern care, an ancient solution reemerged. Traditional Korean medicine herbs, acupuncture, and centuries-old remedies began to flourish, not out of cultural pride, but necessity. With no antibiotics, people turned to ginseng roots, garlic tinctures, and acupuncture needles carved from animal bone. In local clinics that remained open, doctors trained in Western techniques found themselves applying poultices and herbal compresses instead. Still, hope flickered. By the early 2000s, international organizations began to take notice. The World Health Organization launched efforts to provide aid for tuberculosis and malaria treatment. Small shipments of medical supplies trickled into the country, monitored and escorted. But even then, they could not reach everyone. And so, the black market continued to grow, not just in defiance of the state, but in collaboration with it. Some local officials turned a blind eye. After all, they too had families who needed medicine. Then came the quiet innovators, the ones who refused to accept limitations. In Pyongyang Medical University Hospital, Dr. Richol gained a reputation for improvising surgical instruments from scrap metal, for using ultrasound gel made of sugar and water, and for training interns on anatomical diagrams instead of live cases. His motto, whispered in crowded classrooms and dim corridors, was simple: innovation is born from adversity. And in North Korea, adversity was everywhere. The state continued to broadcast images of grand hospitals and miracle cures. Foreign dignitaries were given tours of pristine, empty medical centers in Pyongyang, places where beds were perfectly made and equipment shined under artificial lights. But behind those facades, the truth was undeniable. Real healing happened in candlelit rooms, on wooden floors, in alleyway markets and herbal gardens. For those who lived through it, healthcare in North Korea was not a right. It was a quest, one that demanded resilience, ingenuity, and quiet defiance. So the next time you hear the regime boast about its healthcare system, remember the doctor stitching wounds in the dark. Remember the mother walking 10 miles to buy expired antibiotics. Remember the medicine auntie risking her life for the sake of another's? Because in North Korea, health is not guaranteed. It is fought for patient by patient, dose by dose, in the silent spaces where survival still finds a way. There was a time, not too long ago, when the city of Pyongyang echoed with the sound of church bells. When the streets bore witness to missionaries handing out scriptures, and worshippers knelt in prayer without fear. Back then, before the Korean War tore the peninsula apart, Pyongyang was often referred to as the Jerusalem of the East. It was a city where Christianity flourished, where spiritual life was vibrant and open. But as the smoke of war faded and the iron grip of the Kim dynasty tightened, the sounds of faith grew quieter, replaced by the drumbeat of propaganda and the silence of suppression. Today, towering bronze statues of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il watch over the capital. Grand parades and meticulously choreographed celebrations project unwavering loyalty to the state. But beneath that spectacle lies a truth rarely seen. A country where faith, any faith not sanctioned by the regime, is considered treason. In North Korea, religion is not merely discouraged, it is dangerous. Officially, the Constitution guarantees freedom of belief, but in practice, that freedom is a carefully curated illusion. Churches that remain open in Pyongyang serve not congregations, but foreign diplomats. Their pews are filled not with worshippers, but with actors performing devotion. It is a show for the world, a facade to cover a brutal reality. Behind closed doors and shuttered windows, however, something remarkable continues. Despite decades of repression, whispers of underground worship never ceased. Stories began to circulate quietly, cautiously, of families gathering in basements, of Bibles hidden beneath floorboards, of hymns hummed softly under blankets to avoid detection. In cities like Hamhung and Chongjin, where surveillance is as common as hunger, small groups of believers met in secret, not in cathedrals but in kitchens, not with choirs but with trembling voices that barely rose above a whisper. One woman, now living in Seoul, remembers her childhood in North Korea vividly. Her grandmother kept a torn Bible, smuggled from China, wrapped in cloth and hidden inside a rice sack. Every Sunday, just before dawn, they would sit together, read a few verses, and pray. We did not say Amen out loud, she recalls. Even our prayers had to be silent. The danger was real. Being caught practicing religion outside state-sanctioned churches meant imprisonment, torture, or even execution. The government surveillance network extended into every neighborhood, every workplace. Children were taught to report their parents. Neighbors watched one another with suspicion. Yet, even under such threat, the flame of faith refused to die. In the 1980s, a defector named Father Yu, once a Catholic priest in Racine, described how he turned his small home into a sanctuary. The cross on the wall was carved into the wood so it would not be found unless you knew where to look. He hosted services for a few trusted followers, baptizing children in a cooking pot. When asked why he risked his life, he replied simply, "Because I was called to shepherd, even in the shadows." This quiet defiance was not limited to Christians. Buddhists, too, saw their ancient traditions reduced to relics. Temples dating back centuries became tourist attractions, stripped of incense and reverence, left as hollow monuments to a spiritual past. Monks in the Miryang Mountains continued their rituals in secret, sometimes chanting sutras only under the cover of rainstorms to drown out the sound. Their faith, like that of the underground Christians, adapted, became quieter, stealthier, but it never vanished. In the 1990s, the arduous march brought not only famine and suffering, but a resurgence of spiritual longing. As families buried loved ones and struggled to survive, many turned inward, seeking answers not from the regime, but from something greater. Some saw their faith as rebellion, others as solace. All knew it could cost them everything. One defector, Kim Yoon-jung, summed it up with chilling clarity. In the land of the Kims, faith is the greatest rebellion. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when the regime allowed a glimpse of religious life. In the early 2000s, a South Korean delegation that included religious leaders was granted entry to Pyongyang. They participated in a staged joint prayer service, an act more symbolic than sincere. Cameras clicked. State media reported unity. But behind the forced smiles was a nation where real believers lived in fear. Even so, those brief windows mattered. They offered hope. They reminded those in hiding that they were not forgotten. In recent years, testimonies from defectors have painted an even more vivid picture of underground faith. Flash drives smuggled into the country carried not only Korean dramas and international news, but also videos of worship services, sermons, and Christian songs. Some young North Koreans, watching secretly in their homes, discovered faith through pixels and pirated files. What once entered through missionaries now arrived on memory sticks. Still, the risks remain. A man arrested in 2010 for distributing Bibles was never seen again. A young woman caught attending a secret gathering was sent to a labor camp, where she later died from untreated injuries. These are not isolated incidents. They are warnings etched into the collective memory of a nation. Yet somehow, faith endures. The human spirit, it seems, is not so easily extinguished. It hides in whispers, in candlelit gatherings, in shared verses and silent prayers. It lives on in the secret meetings in cornfields, in the elderly monk who still chants beneath the stars, in the child who learns a hymn without ever knowing its name. In North Korea, to believe is to resist. And while the world watches the grand monuments and missile parades, it is in these hidden sanctuaries that the real story unfolds, not of power, but of quiet courage, not of politics, but of hope. Because beneath every dictatorship lies a pulse of humanity that refuses to die. And sometimes that pulse is a prayer. In a world where information flows endlessly, where news flashes across screens and voices travel across oceans in milliseconds, there exists a place seemingly untouched by this torrent of knowledge, a land where truth is filtered, reality is sculpted, and the flow of information is not a right, but a weapon held tightly by the state. This place is North Korea, where even the whisper of a foreign idea is considered a threat. Here, the government does not just control people's movements or speech. It controls what they know, what they see, and what they are allowed to imagine. From the moment a child can speak, they are taught not to question. The voice of the regime greets them at school, follows them home on government-issued radios, and echoes through neighborhood loudspeakers each morning. Only state-approved media is legal. Radios and televisions sold in North Korea are preset to government frequencies, sealed shut, so they cannot be altered. The Internet, as the world knows it, simply does not exist. Instead, a tightly controlled intranet known as Kwangmyong offers a sanitized view of the world, stripped of contradiction, curiosity, or critique, and yet, despite the overwhelming force of this information blackout, cracks have formed. In those cracks, a different kind of revolution has taken root, not one of guns or protests, but of curiosity, of stolen glimpses into a forbidden world. Imagine this. It is past midnight in a small town near the Chinese border. A family huddles together in silence, their only light a faint glow from a smuggled shortwave radio hidden beneath a pile of blankets. The father adjusts the dial ever so carefully, seeking the fragile frequency of a South Korean broadcast. Static fills the room. Then, a voice. Clear, foreign, real. The family holds their breath. They are not supposed to hear this. They are not supposed to know that such a world exists. But in that moment, they do. These secret listening sessions, known among defectors as midnight journeys, became acts of quiet defiance. For many North Koreans, it was the first time they heard South Korean accents, foreign music, or uncensored news. To hear that others lived differently freely was not just shocking, it was revolutionary. In the 1990s, as famine gripped the nation and state control wavered, these forbidden frequencies became lifelines. A defector named Park Ji-hun later recounted how, during the arduous march, she and her siblings would climb onto the roof at night to get a better signal. In those stolen moments, she said, I traveled a world I would never seen. But listening was only the beginning. Soon came the flash drives. Small, concealable, and almost impossible to trace, USB drives and SD cards smuggled from China began circulating through black markets and Jangmadang networks. These tiny devices carried the weight of another world: K-dramas, pop music, documentaries, news reports, even episodes of Friends. In a country where the regime demanded absolute loyalty, to laugh at a South Korean comedy or cry during a foreign film was to commit ideological treason, yet people did. Teenagers passed drives between friends, hiding them in books or coat linings. A grandmother in Changjin watched South Korean cooking shows to learn how to prepare meals she could never afford to cook. A young man in Hyesan, caught with a flash drive containing Western movies, was arrested and never seen again. His story spread, not as a warning, but as a spark. In border cities like Rason and Musan, the hunger for outside knowledge became insatiable. Despite the regime's efforts, routine inspections, harsh punishments, public executions of smugglers, the information kept coming. Some border guards, tempted by bribes or sympathy, turned a blind eye. Others became participants, helping sneak content in and out for a price. For the regime, this was more than a nuisance. It was a crisis. By the early 2010s, crackdowns intensified. Special patrols searched homes for illegal radios and media devices. Students were interrogated about their influences. A new generation of defectors, shaped not by propaganda but by pirate USB drives, began to speak out. They were not just fleeing hunger, they were fleeing the lie. Even Pyongyang, once the sealed heart of state control, began to feel the ripple. Elite university students, given limited internet access for research, began to skirt firewalls under the radar. A former medical student admitted to staying late at the university library to access foreign academic journals, pretending to research surgeries while reading banned political theory. It was dangerous, he said, but it felt like breathing real air for the first time. There is a saying among defectors, truth is heavier than bullets in North Korea. The regime knows this. That is why it treats flash drives like weapons and radio signals like enemy invasions, because every byte of forbidden content carries the potential to unravel a carefully constructed illusion, yet the hunger for truth persists. A teenage girl in South Pyongan province once watched a smuggled South Korean drama where a character traveled the world. That scene, she later said, changed her life. "I did not even know what an airport was," she recalled. "But after seeing that, I wanted to see the sky from somewhere else." And that, perhaps, is the greatest threat of all. Not the content itself, but what it awakens. The idea that life could be different, that people could be free to choose, to know, to dream. So while the regime builds its firewalls and towers, broadcasts its official news, and silences dissent, there are still those listening in the dark. Still those sharing stories, hiding flash drives, whispering truths. A quiet rebellion carried not by armies, but by questions. And in a country where asking is forbidden, even curiosity becomes an act of courage. In the end, North Korea's most powerful censors may not be enough, because even the thickest curtain cannot block a single beam of light. And sometimes all it takes is one stolen song, one whispered headline, one glimpse of the outside world to change everything. The night was darker than usual, the moon swallowed by heavy clouds. Along the banks of the Tumen River, a winding, icy barrier between North Korea and China, a young woman stood barefoot, clutching her mother's hand. The water shimmered under the faint starlight, cold and unforgiving. With every step into the river, her breath caught not just from the chill, but from the terror of being seen. One wrong move, one flicker of a flashlight, and everything would be over. This was not a scene from fiction. It was the beginning of a defection, one of thousands that have taken place over the decades, each a desperate bid for freedom from a nation where even dreams are regulated. The woman was Park Yeon M.I., and her harrowing journey across borders, betrayal, and brutal reality would later become the memoir In Order to Live, a story that tore through the silence surrounding North Korea and gave it a human face. To flee North Korea is to gamble with death. The regime does not tolerate dissent, and leaving the country without permission is considered treason. Those caught attempting escape often disappear into labor camps or worse. Families of defectors are punished in their stead, condemned to a life of suspicion or retribution, and yet people keep running. They run across barbed wire borders patrolled by armed guards. They run across frozen rivers in the dead of night, their breath masked by scarves and prayers. They run not toward luxury, but toward the mere chance of survival. In the 1980s, one of the first defectors to capture international attention was Kang Chol-hwan, a young man imprisoned in the infamous Yodok concentration camp for a decade. His crime, having grandparents who once lived in Japan. After years of forced labor, starvation, and psychological torture, Kang escaped to South Korea. His book, The Aquariums of Pyongyang, would become a chilling account of life inside North Korea's hidden gulags, a rare first-hand glimpse into a system designed to erase the individual. But not all escape attempts end in memoirs or freedom. In the border towns of Musan and Hyesan, entire underground networks operate to smuggle defectors out of the country. These brokers, part heroes, part opportunists, charge exorbitant sums to lead escapees across China and into Southeast Asia, the first leg of a journey that could eventually lead to South Korea or even the West. But for every safe passage, there is a story of betrayal. Some brokers lured by state rewards hand defectors back to North Korean authorities. Others disappear with the money, leaving their clients stranded in hostile territory. Those who make it into China face another danger, deportation. The Chinese government does not recognize North Koreans as refugees, but as illegal migrants. This means that defectors caught in China are often forcibly returned, and upon return face brutal interrogation, imprisonment, or public execution. Park Yeon-mi's journey was no different. After crossing the river with her mother, they were met not with freedom, but with a new kind of captivity. In China, Park was trafficked, her innocence sold in exchange for silence and shelter. Her mother endured worse, sacrificing herself to protect her daughter. They moved from village to village, hiding in the shadows, praying for a way out. It would take years, a 2,000-mile trek across the Gobi Desert, and the help of missionaries before they would reach South Korea, a land Park had only known through forbidden radio waves. In Seoul, Park was not met with immediate celebration. Like many defectors, she found herself lost between worlds no longer belonging to the rigid uniformity of the North, yet unable to fully integrate into the hyper-modern chaos of the South. Language, culture, even emotions felt foreign. It is one thing to cross a border. It is another to rebuild a life. Yet Park chose to speak, to tell her story, not as a victim, but as a witness. Her voice, soft but unwavering, began to echo across global stages, the UN, international forums, campuses. She spoke not just for herself, but for those who could not. In her words, "I am not the only one. There are still millions who have no voice, who live in darkness, afraid to whisper the word freedom." Defectors like Park and Kang became windows through which the world could finally see what the regime had spent decades hiding. Their stories contradicted the parades, the gleaming buildings, the carefully crafted image of strength. They reminded us that behind the uniform smiles were hungry bellies, bruised souls, and broken dreams. But what makes these stories resonate is not just the suffering, it is the resilience. A former prison guard named Lee, once loyal to the regime, fled after witnessing years of injustice. Her memoir, Eyes of the Tailless Animals, recounts not just atrocities, but moments of quiet courage, a prisoner sharing food with another, a guard who chose to look away instead of report, a mother who sang lullabies in a cell. Another defector, Jang Jin-sung, once worked as a poet for Kim Jong-il's propaganda office. His defection shattered the myth that only the poor or starving sought escape. In truth, even the elite, when faced with the weight of lies, sometimes choose truth at any cost. Still, the path out of North Korea remains treacherous. Today, with tighter surveillance, more border guards, and advanced monitoring technology, escape is even more difficult than before. But it has not stopped. Every year, dozens, sometimes hundreds, still try. They are driven by hunger, by fear, but also by hope. Hope that there is a better life beyond the barbed wire. Hope that one day their voices will not just be heard, but believed. And that, perhaps, is what terrifies the regime most. Not the people who flee, but the stories they carry. Because in those stories lies truth, and truth, once spoken, can never be entirely silenced. In the chill of winter 1995, as the streets of Chongjin filled with the silent march of hollow-eyed children searching for food, the world began to stir. Grain silos were empty. Fields lay barren. And from the sealed borders of North Korea, whispers escaped, whispers of mass starvation, of families boiling grass and tree bark to fill empty stomachs. These were the early days of the arduous march, a famine that would claim up to 1 million lives. But for the first time in decades, Pyongyang had to make a quiet concession. It needed help. Thousands of miles away, in the climate-controlled chambers of Geneva and New York, the international community watched, horrified but uncertain. The images, the testimonies of defectors, and the grainy satellite photos did not lie. Something was deeply, irrevocably broken inside the Hermit Kingdom. In 1995, the United Nations World Food Program launched what would become one of its largest humanitarian relief operations in Asia. For the first time, aid trucks with the UN's blue emblem rumbled across North Korea's desolate countryside. But even as rice bags and medicine crossed the border, trust did not follow. Pyongyang dictated where the aid went, which villages received assistance, and which doors were never to be opened to foreign eyes. Aid workers, under strict surveillance, could only observe what the regime allowed them to see. And still, they went. Because behind every closed gate might be a starving child. Behind every censored report, a life barely clinging on. Yet the famine was only the beginning. As the decade progressed, the floodgates of truth slowly widened. Testimonies began pouring in from defectors, accounts of political prison camps, public executions, systematic torture. It was no longer just about food. The world had to confront something more sinister, North Korea's crimes against its own people. In 2003, the United Nations took a firmer stance. A respected Thai jurist, Vitit Mundharborn, was appointed as the UN Special Rapporteur on North Korean human rights. His task, to shine a light into the darkest corners of the regime. But North Korea refused him entry. Imperialist slander, they called his mission. Still, he pressed on, compiling reports from survivors, documenting stories of women trafficked in China, of children born and raised in prison camps, of people imprisoned for reading the Bible or watching South Korean dramas. Across the Pacific, the United States took notice. In 2004, under President George W. Bush, the North Korean Human Rights Act was signed into law. It was a declaration not just of policy, but of principle. It pledged support to defectors, funding for information dissemination, and a commitment to make human rights part of the broader strategy in dealing with Pyongyang. The promotion of human rights is not only a moral imperative, the act read, but a necessary component of any lasting solution to the North Korean nuclear problem. Europe followed suit. The European Union, alongside Japan, became vocal in United Nations resolutions calling for accountability, for independent investigations, for justice. They were not naive. Diplomatic pressure alone would not dismantle labor camps. But silence, they knew, was complicity. Still, Pyongyang resisted. Again and again, the regime dismissed the world's concerns as hostile acts, accusing the West of using human rights as a political weapon. In one infamous UN session in the early 2010s, a North Korean diplomat scoffed at the accusations, calling them a plot to destabilize our socialist paradise. The irony was not lost on those who had fled that very paradise, leaving behind mass graves and empty bowls. But the world was not unified. Some nations hesitated, worried that too much pressure would only push North Korea further into isolation, endangering fragile diplomatic progress on denuclearization. Others argued that aid should come without strings attached, fearing that conditional assistance would only punish the most vulnerable. And yet, amidst these debates, there were moments of quiet impact. In South Korea, the Hanawon Resettlement Center opened its doors to thousands of defectors, helping them adjust to a world filled with choices, freedom, and confusion. It was not perfect. Many defectors faced discrimination, economic hardship, and emotional trauma. But at least here, their stories could be heard. NGOs stepped in too. Liberty in North Korea Link, the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea HRNK, and countless missionary groups began working behind the scenes rescuing refugees, documenting abuses, broadcasting truth via balloon drops, USB drives, and shortwave radio. Each act of aid, of information, of solidarity, was a whisper against the thunder of oppression, and those whispers mattered. When Jang Jin-sung, a former North Korean propaganda poet, defected and founded New Focus International, His publication became a lifeline, not just for spreading truth to the outside world, but for sending it back in. Flash drives smuggled across the Yalu River carried articles, videos, songs, small seeds of awareness that challenged the regime's monopoly on truth. Even moments of international diplomacy, rare and fleeting, bore symbolic weight. In the early 2000s, a South Korean religious delegation was allowed to hold a joint service in Pyongyang, a moment of quiet faith in a land where religion had long been punished by death. And yet, progress remains agonizingly slow. North Korea continues to operate as a black box, sealed, suspicious, and defiant. The prison camps still exist. The indoctrination of children continues, and the people, caught between the walls of isolation and the gaze of the world, endure. But the international response, however flawed, sends a signal that North Korea is not forgotten, that behind every resolution passed, every aid convoy dispatched, every testimony recorded, there is a fundamental belief that no regime, no matter how secretive or powerful, can erase the dignity of its people. As the sun sets over the Korean peninsula, casting long shadows over barbed wire and propaganda posters, we are reminded of a truth more powerful than any ideology. Silence is the ally of oppression. And to speak out, to protest, to pressure, to bear witness, is the beginning of change. Because one day, when the gates open and history demands its reckoning, the world must be able to say, "We knew, and we did not look away." Beneath the gray skies of a forgotten land, where the silence of fear hangs heavier than the winter frost, a quiet fire still burns. It flickers in the eyes of a mother trading tofu at the Quine, jangmadang in the hands of a surgeon performing miracles by candlelight, in the soft whispers of secret prayers, in the trembling fingers clutching a smuggled USB stick, and in the footsteps of a defector running toward a new life under foreign stars. These are not just scenes from a distant dictatorship. They are the human heartbeat within the machinery of repression. They are the reason the story of North Korea is not merely a tragedy, but a testament. For decades, the regime tried to erase individual voices, drown out dreams beneath the booming anthems of loyalty and the ever-smiling portraits of the supreme leaders. It weaponized hunger, isolated knowledge, and demanded that survival itself be a display of allegiance. But in the most unlikely places, resistance bloomed not always in the form of revolution, but in defiance laced into daily life. A child once whispered a South Korean pop song she had heard on a contraband flash drive. Her voice was soft, afraid but filled with wonder. She did not know the lyrics. She did not know the meaning. But it was different. It was new. And in that moment, even if only for a second, she was free. In Hum Hung, an elderly woman recalled lighting candles for midnight masses in the 1980s, her fingers trembling not from faith, but from fear. She and others gathered in basements, behind drawn curtains, clutching worn-out hymnals smuggled from China. The cost of discovery was death, but the reward was a brief, blinding connection to something greater than control. In a nation where belief was a crime, worship became an act of rebellion. A doctor in Wonsan, without equipment, medicine, or power, performed surgeries guided only by instinct and the dim glow of a candle. When asked how he continued, he said simply, "Because if I do not, they die." Innovation was not a choice. It was the only option left in a broken system. He crafted tools from scavenged parts, used herbal treatments when no drugs remained. He saved lives not because of the state's support, but in spite of its neglect. Even in the icy hush of the countryside, in towns like Musan or Hyesan, children huddled with their families around shortwave radios, volume low, hearts racing, listening to the crackling voices of a world they were told did not exist. One man, now a defector, described those nights as dreams carved into static. The programs were sometimes in languages he did not understand, but they carried a weight proof that another reality was out there. And those who fled, like Parkyon Mi and Kang Chul Huan, did so not just to escape, but to bear witness. They crossed frozen rivers, navigated deserts, endured betrayal and starvation, because they knew the truth must be told. Park's journey through the Gobi Desert, her haunting recollections of fear, hunger, and adaptation in Seoul, have now reached millions. Kang's memories of prison camps, of children tortured for their parents' alleged disloyalties, pull back the veil on horrors too many still refuse to believe. But for every story that surfaces, thousands more remain silenced. Not everyone escapes. Not everyone survives. Yet every act of resilience, no matter how small, is a thread that weaves a much larger truth. The North Korean people are not passive prisoners of history. They are authors of courage, architects of hope. In secret, they teach their children to question. In silence, they choose dignity over fear. In darkness, they keep the flame alive. The world often looks away. Fatigue sets in. The headlines blur. North Korea becomes a caricature, a punchline about haircuts and missile tests, rather than the sprawling human tragedy it truly is. But behind the uniform marches and synchronized cheers is a nation of people who love, weep, dream, and endure, just like anyone else. As this journey comes to an end, one quote echoes louder than all the propaganda North Korea could ever broadcast. It comes from Elie Wiesel, Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate. There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest. Wiesel understood what silence does. He knew how regimes thrive not only on violence, but on indifference. Today, North Korea's people stand as both victims and survivors. Their stories remind us of what is at stake when we allow tyranny to thrive unchecked, when hunger becomes a tool of obedience, when truth is locked behind firewalls, when faith is punished, and when escape is the only form of freedom. This film, like their stories, is a protest. It is a refusal to let silence win. So now the question passes to us, what will we do with what we have heard? Will we scroll past it? Will we forget? Or will we remember that change begins not with grand policies, but with listening, with empathy, with pressure applied over time, and with never turning away? Because as long as someone in Pyongyang dares to whisper the truth, or sing a forbidden song, or dream of a world they have never seen, we owe it to them to keep watching, keep speaking, and keep hoping for their sake and for ours.